Hello and welcome to Late Night Talks. We're back with another political episode this week, and we want to just preface this whole episode by saying that we recorded our interviews with David and Phil before the story came out that Trump released some highly classified intelligence with Russia.
Right. We talked about a lot of things. We talked about Comey, and they even talked about what, the number one thing
we asked them what the most significant thing from the presidency was, and they gave their answers, and I believe their answer might have been different after this story broke.
Right, exactly. So
we did this whole interview without knowing that story had happened because we recorded it before the story broke.
Right, and maybe we should have known that Trump, anything could happen in a matter of, you never know.
There could be another biggest story.
Exactly, and we
tomorrow.
would have to re-record the intro or something like that.
In fact, we should get this up as soon as possible after we record this so that nothing else happens.
Why are we talking so long? We also have a really cool guest next week as well. We're having two Hart District teachers and a COC adjunct professor, or just Hart District teachers.
And what's interesting about them, Samie?
Basically, they are going on a NASA mission with researchers, and they're going to be able to bring some really cool things into the classroom. Yeah,
we're actually going to do a space episode, which is cool. We're going to talk with some local professors who are going to go on a NASA mission sometime this year, later in the year, and we're going to ask them about what exactly they did to get involved with that mission, what they're going to be doing, and I think that should be pretty fun.
Yeah, and I'm sure that's kind of scary. I mean, it sounds really intimidating, so it'll be interesting to hear what they have to say. But for now, we are going to go to David Andrus and Phil Gussin, and we're going to talk about Trump's first couple months in the presidency. Mm-hmm. All right, see you guys soon.
We'll be back after this message.
We focus on students. We're a learner-centered environment, and we help students make that transition.
And we're live with Canyons Radio, your only radio station for College of the Canyons. They take the time out of their day and out of their work schedule to really make sure that the students here are getting the best that they can.
There's a lot of input from the teachers as well as different materials that you can work with. It's really friendly here. Like, all the students are so nice and everybody kind of seems to want to get to know each other.
They come in here and they just want to present great pictures and beautiful art.
The COC MEA program has given me many tools to use in the field, and I love using the same equipment as the pros.
Welcome back to Late Night Talks. We're joined now by David Andrus, Phil Gussin. You guys are political science professors here at College of the Canyons. How are you doing?
Doing great.
Doing well. Thanks for having me.
The first 100 days of Donald Trump's presidency began when he was sworn in at noon on January 20th, 2017. And it's been an interesting presidency. Is that underselling it?
That is a fair assessment.
Right. It's amazing how much controversy this guy has been causing in a given week. Is that also fair to say?
Yeah.
What are your guys' credentials? Let's start with this. What's your background, Phil?
I have a PhD in political science from UCLA, and I teach here at College of the Canyons. Been here for 5 years, well, actually 7 years. My area of emphasis on my research was on the media, public opinion, and American government.
And David?
So I have a undergraduate degree in political science with an emphasis on international affairs, and I have a Juris Doctorate from Southwestern University School of Law. Have worked on a few occasions as an international elections observer via the State Department, and worked also as a consultant on U.S. congressional campaigns and so forth, and been here at COC for about 15 years and currently serve as chair of the Department of Political Science.
Why are people so fascinated with the first 100 days of a presidency?
Typically, when there's no good reason for it. Okay, so that's the first thing that should be said out. Yeah. But typically when presidents come in, they come in with what we call political capital. That is, there's usually a sort of feeling of goodwill towards the president who's won the election. And one of the things we can talk about later on is sort of where presidential power comes from. But it's in that first 100 days, or more accurately, the first part of their administration, when their ability to get things done is probably at its greatest. And so we watch closely the first part of an administration to go ahead and get an idea of the ability of the president to get things done that he's promised to do.
Right. I think that if I'm not mistaken, it started off the measuring of the first 100 days back, I think around FDR's era and so forth. And it might not have a good reason for existing, meaning the 100 days. I do think once something is instituted, it develops a reason. And along the same lines as Phil described, I think regardless of who is controlling Congress, the presidency is elected as the kind of singular voice of the United States. And there is this idea of having the collective will of the people kind of be represented in the first 100 days, kind of that honeymoon period where Congress typically kind of backs up and says, all right, we're going to respect the will of the voters on that national election. And so there is something to be said about, kind of what the president wants to do representing all of America. We hope all of America.
Right, so much so that he even outlined his 100-day plan before he became president.
And so there might not be any good reason whether it's 100 days or 200 days, but I do think there's this idea that politics is so intense that after 100 days, that, people start kind of getting back to or traditionally have gone back to their kind of fighting positions, so to speak. But there is this notion that I think the Congress and the parties realize that the presidency, newly elected is something that everyone should honor at least for a short amount of time.
Do you think there's some kind of learning curve? Because this is the first time that we elected someone who hasn't been in the military or hasn't had a political background.
Right. Well, I think for every president there's a learning curve. Then in the case of Donald Trump, what becomes significant is where on the curve he began. Right. And because he began with such a profound lack of understanding or appreciation of the office, both historically and then institutionally how it works. Even somebody on who's climbing, who's doing well on the learning curve, he's playing catch up, in a big way, unlike other past presidents, having not only no governing experience, but at the federal level, but not at the state level, any experience whatsoever, and so. There's a learning curve for every president. I think every president would tell you that the job was bigger, harder, more complex than they anticipated it to be. And I think everyone would tell you that they got better as it went along.
But he's been probably one of the few presidents who vocalized it. He actually said that. He said it's harder than I thought it would be.
Right.
Well, that's not typically something a president says.
Well, the degree of hubris and arrogance that comes from a statement like that he thought it was going to be, I think what he said is he thought that his job as CEO of his company was going to be as complex as being president, that he thought they were going to be more or less an equal challenge. There's a level of arrogance about that's just stunning. But yeah, but I think other presidents in the past have talked about the fact that it was a learning process and they weren't as good at it.
Yeah, I think if you just look at Bush 41 versus Bush 43, H.W. Bush clearly had enormous amounts of experience in government, and his son W. Bush did not. So the learning curves are different for obvious reasons. For me, the distinction with Donald Trump is, and with anyone really, but especially what seems to be made clear by this kind of statement or multiple statements similar to that he's made about, who knew healthcare was so difficult, is whether or not someone has the ability or the interest in learning, right, and getting better at it. And so clearly you get better at something or you become more aware of something or the difficulty of something by being exposed to it. But he has such a kind of predisposition toward kind of self-confidence, whether that's true or not, deep down inside of him, is that we wonder whether or not he is actually able to learn. Because I think that if he's learning anything from the Comey firing and the incident, the question is, will he be able to convert that kind of knowledge about what the political fallout, what the governing fallout was, will he be able to convert that into the next moment, the next day, the next hour of his presidency? And to date, past the first 100 days, it doesn't look like he's able to build on that.
Yeah. Also, your question brings up sort of an interesting tension within the presidency, and that is that because there's a learning curve, right? In the first term of a president, what you have is you have the point at which they're least experienced at what they're doing at the time of what should be their maximum impact. And those two things can run into one another. You've got the lack of experience, maximum impact, and usually people try and resolve that as quickly as possible. But as for what David's saying, it looks like when he runs into problems, he doesn't there's no self-reflection. What can I do differently? How can I do it differently? Right. It's who screwed up and who can I blame for what just happened.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunate.
There's clearly an impulsive nature to his personality that I think has been well documented and so forth. And maybe some people celebrate that in many ways as a way to buck the system. But there is, I question that. But I think the impulsiveness is very destructive to him. Forget about, and we can analyze whether it's good for the country or the Republican Party, what have you. Just for him and his presidency, what does he want to achieve and accomplish? His own impulsiveness and his inability to kind of learn very quickly about certain things is really damaging his ability to get anything done.
So that impulsiveness kind of creates like a credibility issue with him, right? I mean, can we really trust what he says he's going to do? And what's scarier is if there's happens to be a crisis with North Korea or with terrorism, can he build a coalition with other nations, with other states to kind of solve a problem as big as that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people that think that all presidents lie, and I think we can prove that that's probably true.
Yeah.
In many ways, they lie strategically to get policy, kind of adopted and so forth, or they lie for any other reason, or they kind of fudge the truth. And so no one's denying that happens. I think with President Trump, it's the nature of his lies, right? They seem so utterly useless, meaning lying about the size of the crowd at the inauguration or other things like that. He seems hell-bent on defending issues that really have nothing to do with making his presidency a success. It seems to be a personality issue for him. And so in that sense, I think his credibility as a president is literally day by day, hour by hour. And for anybody that thinks, just wants to look at past presidents and how they've been dishonest, it's a qualitative, kind of analysis. It's contextual and so forth. And I don't think we've ever seen someone as unconventional in terms of President Trump, of what he seems to, prioritize as a problem for him, and how he reacts to that. And so it is a problem because it isn't just about, our adversaries, it's our allies, who can rely upon us. And at this point, what I want to say is that for anybody that wants, or if he needs someone to join his administration, to be part of his team, I think he's going to have a hard time getting anyone to jump on board and be a part of his administration, because we know from last week's events that you can't rely on him to back you up, or if you go out on a limb and defend him, you might actually be, kind of contradicted within the second to the minute based on a tweet or something else. And so I think he's hurting himself and his credibility, not only internationally, nationally, but within his own White House. Right.
Credibility might not be his strong suit, but one of his strong suits is supposed to be the art of the deal, right?
Correct.
He's a businessman, and he that's a book that he wrote, The Art of the Deal, right? One of Trump's most famous campaign platforms was the wall, and he said Mexico will pay for it, but Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto said that he would not pay for it. So just 7 days into the presidency, on January 27th, Trump had planned to meet with Peña Nieto at the White House to discuss things like border security, and Trump announced that the U.S. would impose a 20% tariff on Mexican goods to effectively pay for the wall. The Mexican president canceled their meeting once Trump said that. You're an international relations guy. When we see something like this happen, what does it say about Trump as a master of the art of the deal?
Well, as I've said in multiple forums, and Phil's heard this multiple times, and that is that I think, business is very vertical, right? It's very top down, and, obviously you can fire people, you can have directives throughout your, corporate structure and be listened to. Government is very horizontal. International relations is very horizontal among nation states, even though there's varying degrees of power. And you have to nurture, right, those relationships, and you have to find a way to achieve the outcomes you want, not necessarily by just dictating or having bravado. And to me, it shows a lack of appreciation for the varied aspects of power, centers of power and influence, and actually the limitations of power, and what it really means to be a leader on the international stage. And so when you dictate to another country that you will pay for this and this is what we're going to do, you set yourself up for failure.
And here we are 100 days later, and Mexico still hasn't entered in any agreement to pay for the wall, and there hasn't been any tariffs put in place.
Right, and I just think that it just shows a lack of appreciation for the complexity of dealing with, the kind of the global community and even your neighbor next door, and what are the consequences of trying to achieve that. As former Secretary of State James Baker III would always talk about how if you're trying to work out, negotiate a deal with another nation state, and you have your diplomatic ducks in a row in your home country, but the other country does not, you have to help them achieve their own, their own ability in their own country to have everyone be on board for that diplomatic kind of agreement. And so you really have to be very thoughtful on many levels, and just to kind of dictate to Mexico that this is what you'll do and so forth. It just shows a total lack of appreciation for the environment of international affairs and government versus business.
And that gets back to the difference between being a CEO and a business owner and being a diplomat, as the president is supposed to be. And that is that in business, it's a zero-sum game, right? Any money that you don't get, the other side gets, and vice versa. And so there's a winner and loser in each one of these negotiations. In diplomacy, the goal is to try and have both sides win, because that's going to be sustainable and it's going to last beyond your presidency. And he doesn't understand that. He seems to have a sort of a one approach to go ahead to negotiation. That is to be a bully, kind of like sort of say, this is what we're going to do, and that's the end of the negotiations. That might work when you are a billionaire sort of imposing your will on subcontractors who don't have the money to fight you, they don't have the lawyers. That might work. But in the international realm, it's so much more complicated, so much more nuanced. And then to make the predicament even more difficult, the institutional apparatus that the president has at his disposal via the State Department, all the various regional specialists, and can go ahead and provide valuable information and feed information to the president so that he understands and appreciates this nuance. And those positions in the State Department right now are essentially vacant. And I think it's because he figures what he said during the convention, I alone can fix this. He has such a belief in his own ability to go ahead and manage these things that it's leading him astray. And the real scary part and sad part is that he has not surrounded himself with people who have the guts to say, no, Mr. President, you don't. We need to work as a team.
Because whenever anyone does that, don't they get fired? Isn't that kind of the case?
Right. I mean, I think that it's very difficult. We're back to whether he's open to learning. Right. He's open to being self-aware about what he needs to get better at, where his strengths and weaknesses are. And just really quickly on Phil's point about how in diplomacy everyone, we hope, is going to win through a diplomatic agreement. I don't disagree with that, but it is interesting because even if we take, say, the much maligned neoliberal approach, there are outcomes in diplomatic affairs that are absolute or relative. Most states want to try to get the best end of the deal in any diplomatic arrangement. Not always, but quite often, especially that's true of kind of neoliberal approaches. And so even if Donald Trump wants to put the America First kind of approach into diplomacy, you still have to nurture that. You can't just cram it down someone's throat. If you want somehow or another to have a relative gain, even though everyone's going to gain on some level, you're going to have some type of a problem with them buying into that if you are trying to rub their nose in it, so to speak. And so you really have to nurture diplomatic outcomes, even if you, as the superpower, are going to get the best end of that bargain. And it just takes a lot of skill and time and effort. And so it's much different than, as Phil said, the corporate sector.
Political scientists David Andrus and Phil Gussin are in studio with us. We're going to talk about Trump's first 100 days when we come back from this break. I want to ask you guys about Trump. Some people are comparing this government, this White House, with an authoritarian government. I think Phil might have something to say about that. We'll be back after these words.
They've been very caring. They care about every single student that's in the class.
Yeah, everyone seems to be pretty friendly with each other. No one's really afraid to ask each other for help. working with other people, not being ornery, actually listening to what people say, collaborating with them to create a really good product.
It's great to use the same stuff the pros use, especially at a community college.
Hopefully we give them a pathway to have their creativity showcased.
I've gotten a great education.
I love the access to equipment.
I've made lifelong friendships.
I have great teachers.
All right, we are back with Late Night Talks. Now, we talked a little bit about Donald Trump maybe showing signs of being an authoritarian figure. Is he showing signs of that? And if he is, can our democracy, can our system handle a figure like that? Because he's a pretty unique person. We haven't had someone like that before.
Right, I think, and this may actually be one of the areas where Dave and I have a slightly different take on it. I don't see the United States slipping into an authoritarian regime. Because
Can you give us a brief definition of an authoritarian government?
To me, the way I would define an authoritarian regime is where the government is essentially controlling not everything, but most of sort of the distribution of goods and privileges and resources. In other words, the government is controlling, in the definition that E. Schatzsnyder uses, the allocation of benefits and privileges, the idea that the government is basically limiting what people can do, what businesses can do, and restricting rights. But in an authoritarian regime, there are other institutions that exist that are outside the control of the authoritarian. There's probably multiple definitions. My point is that one of the things that I've been encouraged by in the face of Donald Trump's presidency has been that other institutions have in fact risen up to go ahead and prevent excesses, because the framers were really concerned about excesses, especially from the executive branch. And so Congress has actually stood up in some ways to go ahead and prevent his excesses. The budget that was recently passed, the budget resolution that was passed, didn't contain a lot of the elements of what Donald Trump had asked for. There wasn't even funding for any part of the wall. So the agreement that was reached, that had to be reached with compromise, prevented Donald Trump from sort of instituting what he wanted to do. When the travel ban was instituted, state attorneys generals sued, and the courts prevented those bans from being implemented. And so there've been and within the bureaucracy, he's gotten pushback from people within the bureaucracy. And so what it's done is it's contained him exactly the way I think the system was designed to do.
The checks and balances are working.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. They're working. It's still scary because it's sort of watching a wall that's holding back water and wondering, is it going to break? Is it going to break? But the longer it holds him back, the more convinced I am that it's going to succeed. So I'm not so much worried about us drifting into authoritarianism. But having said that, I do think that our institutions, this is what James Clapper, the former director of national intelligence, said. He said that our political system is under attack from the outside and the inside. And from the outside, he was talking about the Russians and their efforts to go ahead and attack our institutions from the outside. From the inside, he was talking about Donald Trump and what he has done and what he's trying to do. His attacks on the media have been particularly alarming, referring to the media as the enemy of the people.
He shut out some outlets from going to a press conference one time.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, and in fairness, President Obama did that one time. He kept out Fox News. What happened is the other networks stood up and said, you can't do that, right? And they understood the danger that presented. So I'm not as worried about that as other commentators are. And actually, I'm interested in what David has to say because he may have a different take on this.
Well, I mean, I'm going to take a larger kind of historical look at it for the last 30 or 40 years, and that is that, out of the three branches of government, clearly the judiciary, the U.S. Supreme Court, is noted as having the final say on what's constitutional. Right. So we could say that that's the most powerful branch. But in actuality, it's the executive branch that has the enforcement power. And if you look at the expansion of the executive branch and its powers and the presidency over the last many decades, there's no doubt about it that it dwarfs dwarfs in terms of power and influence the other branches. It just does. Now that doesn't mean that we're in an authoritarian regime, but what it does, if you look at from Nixon, through Reagan, through the Bush years, and Clinton and Obama and so forth, it's just a steady expansion of executive power, seemingly all constitutional, but it's still expanding that. The difference with Donald Trump is that he uses authoritarian language that can be referenced, mainline right back to Mussolini and Hitler and so forth. And when he talks about the press is the enemy, right? When he talks about making America great again, these are things that other prior authoritarian regimes have used. When in the separation of powers doctrine, with the enforcement branch, if we're talking about the FBI and the Justice Department, they fall within the chain of command to a large extent of the executive branch. And so that presents a lot of challenges about the integrity of this system moving forward, right? Because it's one thing for Congress to be free and independent of Donald Trump and have oversight. It's another thing for the investigative units of the executive branch to be free of, in fact, the chief executive. And those are challenges for a democracy. What I think I'm worried about is not that we're going to slide into some traditional kind of obvious authoritarian regime. I'm worried about whether we'll become what is known as an illiberal democracy, right? A sham democracy, a democracy in name but not in practice, okay? So what I'm concerned about is 40 years from now, the United States will be here, but what will it be? I mean, the Constitution can be here, right? You can have all the institutions here, but what will their output and will their function be? Because as these institutions and as this behavior evolves, the question is, are all the checks and balances, are all the agencies and the institutions that are necessary to reinforce democratic governance, do they have integrity?
Right, because
and that's what I'm worried about.
It seems like there might be something wrong with Donald Trump being able to fire someone who's in charge of an investigation that's investigating him.
So here's a really great point to that, and that is, I think most people that are in favor of the firing point to the fact that he seemingly has the technical, legal authority to do so. So no one's disputing that.
Right.
But the question is that just because you have the legal authority to do so, does that mean in doing so that you're not damaging democracy or damaging the credibility of the government in other ways, especially when you have all these mixed messages over a 24-hour period, but there is an active investigation going on of you and your former campaign staff and so forth as it relates to the Russia connections to the election. So technically you can be allowed to do something, but that doesn't mean that you're not paying a larger price and damaging the institutions and the values of society in doing so.
And anytime a president exercises authority, it makes it that much easier for the next president to do so. Right. So firing an FBI director Donald Trump just made it easier for the next president to go ahead and do that, because it's not going to be the first time. The other time somebody was fired, there were some ethical violations, but it wasn't while the president himself was being investigated. And so that's the danger. Like, what doors is he opening up? The one other check that I would point out on the presidency is the people. In 2018, we're going to have an election again. And what I would want people to understand is that if the people in power, and I'm talking about Congress right now, aren't fulfilling their constitutional obligation to go ahead and place a check on the presidency, then we the people are the final check. And I'm not saying that you need to elect Democrats. There are plenty of Republicans who are troubled by the excesses of Donald Trump's sort of behavior, that if we need to get rid of the people who aren't fulfilling that constitutional obligation and replacing them with people who appreciate it, then ultimately we can't wait for other people to fix this problem. It falls on us. And so that's just something that in checks and balances, we often leave the people out of it. And I don't think that that's a fair assessment.
And
of
I
the
think
way it
if that
works.
doesn't happen, that's where you slide into an illiberal democracy, because of you have to have, I saw on TV recently, I think David Gergen was saying, what does this whole last week say about us as Americans? And I think the question is, what's happening to our political culture? Are there in fact a host of shared values that transcend party identification? And I think that's what's important, right? Are the American people going to step up and say, regardless of party, affiliation, that there's something more important, and that is the sound institutions and behavior of this country. And I think if you don't have people doing that, right, and they give everyone a pass for not kind of fulfilling the oversight mechanisms as thoroughly as they can, then, you know, it doesn't bode well for the country.
You know, I want to ask you guys, so much has happened in the first 100 days, and even a little bit has happened past this 100-day mark now. You know, the Syrian government launched a chemical attack on its own civilians, and then we sent the cruise missiles over. Trump's projected to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on his own family, him and his own family traveling places for vacations. He signed all kinds of executive orders. There was the travel ban. I want to ask each of you what you think the most significant event was in this first 100 days. What do you think is going to be the most significant event going forward now?
Well, every week you would ask me that. The answer would be what happened last. I think
because there's so much going on every week.
Yeah, because there's so much. I mean, I wake up every day and I check the news and fearful, like what the hell is
It's stressful.
happening? What was I
stressful.
sleeping? Right. And when I'm watching the news, my family's like, I can't be in here while you're watching the news. I thought the firing of Comey was huge. It was huge, and the extent to which he threw his entire communications team and the vice president under the bus was a stunning development. For the reasons firing an FBI director when your campaign is under investigation, that's problematic alone. But the incompetence that it demonstrated in him going ahead and letting two spokespeople and the vice president go out and give an explanation for why Comey was fired, and then for him to go ahead and completely undermine them, showed a level of dysfunction in the White House that's problematic. And it kind of comes back to the question you were asking, Samie, is that when the credibility of the White House is damaged so severely, what happens if a real crisis emerges? Most of the crises that have happened have been ones of Donald Trump's own making, right? But what if a real one? Because I just saw a report today that they were saying that the Syrian government has been hanging and cremating people in Syria. And when I read that, normally I would just be alarmed. But now I have to ask myself, is this true? Right? And that's problematic.
I do want to say that going back to a previous point, and that is that other presidents have sent their advisors out, all right, to speak on their behalf, and they've undercut them. I mean, Bill Clinton famously did this when he sent advisors out, or advisors were green-lighted to go out, or they felt confident about going out and defending him against charges that he had extramarital affairs and had a relationship with Monica Lewinsky and so forth. And then, of course, it turns out they had egg on their face after they had done that. What I think is important to understand is that it is not a tit for tat. This is a matter of degrees, right? This is a matter of the level of incompetence, right? The level of egregious behavior, the level of inconsistency between the president and his immediate staff on a day-to-day basis. So if anyone wants to just kind of look at, well, we can always point to previous administrations, you can. But the reason everyone is so upset or so uptight and quite filled with anxiety is because of the degree to which this is happening. So I will have to say, to answer your original question, that for me it is the current state of affairs with Comey, and the reason I say that is because previously I think Phil and I and others were talking about Donald Trump's behavior along with policy issues that we either agreed or disagreed with or what have you. Right now the whole national dialogue has shifted into a civics lesson. This is purely a civics lesson about separation of powers, checks and balances, executive authority, and so forth. And I think that we know by the interview with Lester Holt last week, there are now statements and analyses coming out that show that he might have in fact be up for obstruction of justice charges by saying that he fired Comey because of the Russia investigation. So now this becomes a grave constitutional issue for him, and I think it speaks to, more so than any other week in his presidency, the dysfunction and the lack of clarity about what he wants to achieve as a president and whether he has the ability to, and his staff has the ability to achieve anything, meaningful, right, for either the party he belongs belongs to or for the country, because now it's purely a civics lesson.
We're running out of time, but I want to ask one thing. I mean, I think a lot of people have this hopeless feeling. They feel like they can't really do anything. They're just watching the news, seeing the president tweet out ridiculous things. I mean, what is their role right now? What should they be doing?
They being the citizens?
Yeah.
Well, I think sort of if they're what Dave's talking about is if they're paying attention and they're learning the lessons, the civics lessons that we need to know about how our government actually works. That's going to be part of it. But participating, voting, getting out and doing things, being active, and not just waiting till the November election, but making your voice heard, talking to other people, discussing what's going on, is really at this point what citizens can do. But again, without leaving anybody, I don't think we should walk away from this with a sense of despair.
Right.
In my estimation, the institutions are working the way they're supposed to. Donald Trump, regardless of his incompetence, has not done severe damage to the United States, either internally or externally. That doesn't mean it's not possible in the future, but right now, our system, as imperfect as it is, it's holding. And that should encourage people. But not be an excuse for inaction.
Right. You just expressed the feeling you think people have right now. I think they've had it for years and years, and I've talked to students and other people about that. So I think what's true now has always been true over recent years, and that is that people need to understand that this is a very affluent, fortunate country that we live in, but you cannot take it for granted. And there has to be some type of investment in the system. And so people have multiple roles to play as citizens. They have, obviously they have a family and they have a career and so forth. And Phil and I don't recruit everyone to be poli-sci majors. We recruit them to be active citizens that are informed about what's going on, because that's what's necessary in a kind of a vibrant democratic state. And unless people are informed and get involved, the system's not going to work. And through that involvement comes a lot of meaning and a lot of great experiences, even if sometimes, in democracy, you have to learn how to lose, right? That's just part of it. It isn't about always being happy. It isn't about always winning, but it is about the process and being involved. And I think more so than ever, although people are active as a resistance movement to Donald Trump, people were active in getting Donald Trump elected. I think the question is that when are people going to be involved beyond that, beyond resisting or advocating for a person or a movement? When are they going to take policy issues and structural issues to heart in their day-to-day lives? So they need to.
Do we need somebody to run against Trump, and do they need to start campaigning right now since Trump is starting to campaign right now? He's done a few campaign rallies.
When you say we, I don't know. I don't know who you mean. So, well, I think the Democrats are a mess, right? I mean, I don't think they know who their national candidates are. Certainly, they have to somehow or another define who they want to be ideologically, policy-wise, and so that says a lot about who will emerge and so forth. Who wants to take on President Trump? But this is right now. I don't know, who's thinking about running 4 years from now in terms of the Democratic Party or any other party. I don't know. I think there's so much going on in terms of trying to understand what's happening with Donald Trump and the Republican Party. Clearly someone's going to run against him, and I question whether he'll want to run for a second term, assuming he makes it through the first term, because now there's so much talk about, illegal behavior and impeachment and all of that. And I'm not saying we're at the doorstep of that, but definitely someone's going to run against him. That's for sure.
And there's a deep schism in the Democratic Party between the people who back Bernie Sanders and favor a more progressive agenda, and the people who backed Hillary Clinton and favor what I'll call a more incremental change in the system, movement towards a progressive agenda, but a slow movement towards it. And that schism has not healed. There's still anger on both sides. And so they're going to, at least by the time 2020 comes around, if they haven't figured that out, then the battle that they fought out in 2016 is just going to happen again.
Right.
Phil, David, before we wrap up, I want you guys to plug your respective classes. What courses can we see you guys teaching next semester?
Well, I teach Introduction to American Government, but I also teach the Model United Nations class, and so I'll plug the Model United Nations class. Anybody who's interested in being overworked, overstressed, they should consider, and they're interested in sort of learning leadership skills under my watchful eye and the watchful eye of other experienced delegates. They should go ahead and consider looking into the class, or at least contacting me.
And I'll, as usual, we all teach Introduction to American Government courses and so forth, but I'll be teaching Political Science 250, which is comparative government and politics. And that overlaps a lot with international relations, but it tends to obviously look at the components of a state, of a country, and then kind of compare and contrast across lines, and that would be democratic, non-democratic governments and so forth. So that's offered in the fall.
And then one last thing, after the 100 days, we did the Professor Showdown. That was kind of the impetus for going ahead and doing this. We will have another showdown, as we call it, probably in 200 days or at some point later on. And so people should keep...
This is when COC professors get together and they actually have a debate.
Absolutely.
Sponsored
People can
by
watch it.
the Political Science Club.
Right, and the Model UN Club as well. So so we'll be doing this periodically because I suspect there's going to be no shortage of material.
Yes, for material. Exactly.
Thank you guys for being on. Maybe we'll do this again for 200 days.
Appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very
Absolutely.
much.
David Andrews, Phil Gussin, political
Thank you
science
very
professors at COC. We'll be back next week with another episode of Late Night Talks.
Fantastic.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.